Right. Yeah, I decided to leave off the coffee beans. Just the thing.
I know I get to stare at prayer hands. Yeah.
Praying man.
Praying man. Praying mantis. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Banned Books Podcast, episode 157, 58, 55. We're in the mid-50s.
Yeah, 55.
How time flies when you do 2 episodes a week.
Except I don't split them, so that's why we're only at 155.
Oh, you're not doing that anymore? Okay.
No.
That's why I'm only getting
you
one
can tighten
show
it
now.
up if you want, but yeah.
I don't even know if that's possible at this point.
We do our best.
To not tighten it up?
Well,
Keep
and I
it
think
loose?
it made more sense when people are doing a lot of commuting, but they haven't really been. So
Yeah, the number of podcasts that I've listened to since March has significantly decreased.
has it?
Yeah. That's why I was surprised that at least with the Warrior Priest podcast, my numbers have gone up.
Yeah. Well, ours have here too, even with the long form, which is kind of surprising. But I think it's somewhat subject matter. And
Sure.
then, I mean, like for me, I've been back on the bike, so I listen while I'm on the bike, get through a couple shows usually on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know.
Well, and there's just so many.
It's true.
Because the flip side of it is, so yesterday, 2 days ago, I put out the Warrior Priest podcast, and I did an episode on a guy named Kevin Ross. He's a fighter.
Yeah, I saw that.
Muay Thai fighter. And the weird thing about the world that I live in is that these people, even though they're world champions, they're very open and available. So I did this podcast and then tagged him on Instagram, and then he reposted it onto his Instagram. So I texted him and just said thank you and how much I respect what he does, and he texted me back.
Yeah.
And it's just that weird, like, crossing that boundary of like, oh, you know who I am because you listen to my podcast.
Well, you have a sense of celebrity that isn't always grounded in reality, right?
Right.
People have bigger heads than you really think, than they really do.
That's the weird thing about podcasting to me anyways, is that, and like even for us, right, when we do conferences and people come up to us and they say, well, I listened to the show on XYZ, and especially when people say things like, it really changes my life. It's really weird because we're just having this conversation and we have it before we hit record. We're having it after we hit record. And then people come up and say, that was really important to me, or I really appreciated what you had to say, or I can't go a week without listening to your podcast. Or the really weirdos who are like, I listened to your entire series of podcasts on my drive to the conference. It's like, how are you still conscious?
Yeah, right. Well, and I think there's something about the nature of podcasting, which a lot of people have had, conversation about, is that it allows for long form. So that's unique, especially, like I mentioned to you before we went on that I listened to the neuroscientist that was on Joe Rogan
last week.
Yeah. And it was almost 3 hours long. I listened to it on a drive back, from Indiana. So I had 3 hours. I also listened to it faster than normal speed. But still, it's just like time flies. And it's like, really? That's not like a 20 or 30, 40-minute show, right? So there's that. But then there's also, like you said, a saturation. There's so much that you can pick and choose. You can kind of create your own little, talk radio station if you want.
Yeah.
But think about, like, if you listen to every show that even our network, 1517, podcast network put out, if you listen to all those shows, you've got a week worth of listening.
Right.
Easily.
Well, yeah,
every
that's
week.
My point is that when I connect with people then through either my own podcasting or through Rogan or some other podcast I listen to, and then I say to myself, I'm going to go check out Liam Harrison's new podcast. He's a Muay Thai fighter. He's got a lot of wisdom. I like the people that he's surrounded by. And all of a sudden I have another podcast to listen to. And then Liam has someone on. And then I listen to that person. I want to go listen to this person's podcast. And all of a sudden I have 2 new podcasts.
Yeah.
And it just grows exponentially because at least I want to be engaged with those conversations because I'm gaining from it. But there's so many conversations that, what did you tell me? I think the metrics are like the average podcast is 112 downloads?
Something like that. Yeah. It's very, very small.
But we only usually focus on the Rogan podcasts,
which get millions and millions of downloads.
Which get millions. Versus, the average podcast gets around 100, 150 downloads for one episode.
And that's actually good. I mean, or that would be considered good, I think, by those content producers, and so I guess the question is, how valuable is it as an art or as a form? And that's just a sliding scale. It depends on how you want to value it. And, for us, I mean, we're creeping up towards 1,000 downloads,
Yeah.
on some episodes, which I can't even get my head around because I can barely think of like 10 people's names,
Right. Well,
much
there's
less
that too.
100 or 1,000.
Right.
So, I mean, there are people listening and they're appreciating the show and they're letting us know that. And we're thankful for that. I think we changed too, though, through the show. But it's far less obvious, maybe, or acute to us as it is to those who are listening.
Well, philosophically, I came to this conclusion after the second podcast that we did way back in the
We're
past.
We're on our third iteration here.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm on my fourth. And
is that right?
This is my
4?
third, and then my Warrior Priest podcast.
Oh, right, your fourth show, right?
But I think what I embraced, anyways, philosophically, is that I refuse to be conditioned by a set of static boundaries. It's this way, and it has to remain this way forever. Like the Tonight Show, for example, the old Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. That was a format that had been established by Jack Parr, and this is the Tonight Show. You turn on the TV at this time of night, this is what you're going to get every night, consistently 5 nights a week, the whole year round. And then all these other talk shows basically just copied that format. But then with the rise of the internet, the rise of podcasting, the rise of YouTube, that format died. And people quit watching it because they wanted more choice, more variety. And with podcasting, like you said, now you can actually, not only are you producing the content, but you're curating the content and then you're consuming the content. So it's this strange ecosystem of commerce then that you're producing it, people are consuming it, they're choosing whether or not to pay for it if you go with that route.
Or advertising supported
podcasts, so it becomes this ecosystem of like, you're supporting my podcast, giving me feedback, so then I seek your podcast out, give you feedback, support you, and it just grows that way. And like you said, there's some podcasts I listen to that are 15 minutes, and there's others that are 3 or 4 hours.
Right.
But I can curate the amount of information that I'm taking in on a daily or weekly basis.
Right. And I think the curation is really important because, like for me, I have some devotional ones. I have some like ancient wisdom ones, some, like Daily Stoic or something.
Yeah.
That fit in there. I've got like a music one that's music history, where it's like 2 or 3 minutes. I've got like a word of the day. So I have some daily ones that kind of round out just like basic, just character and knowledge and wisdom,
Right.
It's a great way to start the day for me. It's just to get my brain going and think about some of these things. But then also those long forms that fit in, and a few of them I'm like committed to, right? I'm going to listen to every episode, the whole thing, because it just, whatever, there's magic there for me, right? Where they have a combination of, say, entertainment and value and information. But then there's others where I pick and choose, and I think that's beautiful. So we've gotten away from our format a little bit here and there during COVID, especially, right?
Unbelievable.
It's clockwork.
Like clockwork. That's my phone. And they're cutting down trees outside. So for those of you who are watching the recording, the county showed up to cut down trees on the other side of the road. So that's noise. And then my phone never rings.
And my kids are surprisingly quiet today. So,
yeah.
Go figure. The dog's not barking. Nothing.
It's crazy.
So while he's talking on the phone, I'm not going to edit this out of the video. So all of you who are watching on YouTube get to see what actually happens when we record live.
It's like that. I had this phone on my desk for 2 weeks, just in case that happened. Didn't ring one time. Put it back in the receiver on the other side of my office, and it rings.
Yeah. All right. So what are we talking about? Format. So we got away from it a little bit with COVID, and we did some more free form and just conversational stuff. And just kind of trying to think through, life in this weird, wacky world we live in. And then, but I think, it's nice to get back to looking at a text and talk through, somebody. There's a way that also, our conversation has gotten us into trouble with our listeners, right? We talked about that in the last episode.
Yeah.
In a sense, because we weren't being buffered through like, well, that's just Augustine, right?
Right.
Now it's like, oh, that's Riley.
But that's my attitude
colors.
too, is if you don't like what we're talking about, don't listen.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go out of my way to offend or tweak anybody's nose, but at the same time, this is our podcast.
Yeah.
This is our opinion. This is our interpretation of events.
Well, and
informed, ill-informed,
it's
poorly
a fair
informed.
criticism to say, well, you've kind of gotten away from your original format. That's fair.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But like we talked about too, then on that point, when we read a historical text, we're dealing with historical events. I don't think, at least in my conversations with people, most people don't then ask the secondary question, are these events still
Yeah.
occurring in the present tense, or
The so
how?
what, right?
Right. Like slavery didn't end in 1865, but we like to think it did.
It began in 1619.
Well, did it? Address your hate mail to Christopher's recipe. You should make a
Oh,
1619 coffee blend
oh,
where all of the beans are burnt and only half the bag is full.
wow. Wow, that's intense.
Yeah,
Yeah, no. Slavery, just read the Bible.
exactly. It's always been with us.
We don't have to like it. Just like we talked about human trafficking. You don't
But
have
I
to like that
think
either. It's been around.
by and large, I think a majority of people are more comfortable dealing with things that happened in the past because that's a safe distance.
It abstracts it, right?
It abstracts it and it allows us in the present tense to not ask the really difficult questions, such as, can you preach the gospel in the absence of what's happening around you? Can you preach the
Or
law in the absence of what's happening around you?
is what's happening around you, so peculiar,
Mm-hmm.
so innovative or unique that,
Right.
reading an ancient isn't going to apply. It's like,
Right.
I read a funny criticism of Christian homeschoolers last week, which I thought was funny, where they say, well, they're only going to know about astronomy from, some ancient guy. And you're like, yeah, that might be true if they're like one of these classical Christian ed people.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll still probably know more astronomy than your kids do. So,
True.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe they haven't, they got as far as Kepler and then that's where it kind of got, derailed. And like,
Right.
yeah, except they know something about the motion of planets and stars.
Right.
And, that's why this criticism of like saying, well, keep the Bible, stay back in the Bible times or something like that. Like, no,
Sure.
actually all this stuff still applies today. I actually did that in the sermon yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I said, when Jesus was talking we had the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus talking to the disciples, we said, yeah, actually he's talking to you,
Right.
And what are you saying? How are you going to feed people here in this wilderness?
Mm-hmm.
And so to say it's not appropriate or applicable now, not
Right.
just in an analogical kind of way, but like, no,
Right.
this is nothing. What happened then? Same thing happens today.
Right.
There's nothing new. Solomon was
Mm-hmm.
right about that.
Right.
So let's talk about, we can talk about warfare from Augustine, and the warfare hasn't, maybe the way that it's warred, the
Mm-hmm.
means, the rules,
Right.
those
The
might have
hardware has
changed.
changed,
The hardware, the
but the
techniques, the
basic tactics
strategies.
haven't.
You don't think, yeah, maybe tactics haven't. Well, that's what
Basic
that's like,
tactics haven't. I mean, you read Jocko's book,
right.
and there's other books from Vietnam, for example, that are on guerrilla warfare, for example. And
I love listening to Jocko when he says things like he's reading some Chinese guy, from
Mhm.
4,000 years ago.
Yeah. Yep.
And he's like, oh, there's extreme ownership.
Yep. There's
where
cover and move.
where he sees his own, like,
Yeah.
he stumbled on these strategies, right?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
through practice. And then you look back in the ancients and they're like, they already knew it,
Right.
but maybe you aren't willing to listen. I guess that's part of it too.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that before, and I think that's true. And this maybe goes to circles back around to the original thesis, which is I could not. I read the Stoics when I was in my 20s
Mm-hmm.
in college. Didn't understand a word. Thought they were useless.
Made no sense to me.
But I didn't want to listen,
Well,
and I had no life experience.
it seemed like just trite moralism.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Especially for me at that time, I did not need trite moralism. But now, when I picked them up at 45 and read Marcus and Epictetus and Musinius Rufus and others, I was like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I've wanted. This is exactly what I'm looking for in relation to vocation.
Yeah.
This is great stuff.
Yeah.
But when I was 22, 21 years old, I was morally bankrupt.
Mm.
And my moral weather vane was, well, if it makes me feel good, it's good. Whereas
Yeah.
at 45, I'm saying to myself, I'm a father, I'm a parent, I'm a
Yeah, that's the
pastor.
difference. Mm-hmm.
The world seems different from the other side of the street now.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I need guidance in morality. I need guidance in natural law, for example.
Right.
And I need, yeah, go ahead.
You could get a lot of it from, if not most everything from the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you have to be willing to listen.
Right.
and to read, and you read Ecclesiastes, read Proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
This is I was wondering about that as I was listening. Oh, I don't know, it was a quote from some guy, some Stoic, one of your friends. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it was Zeno. It was Zeno, right? And he was shipwrecked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he lost everything. And he's like, well, just start over, do something, do the new
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's you could get the same thing from Solomon
Right.
if you wanted. So which came first? Not
Mm-hmm.
actually the point. And that, I guess it's an interesting
Right.
question.
Right.
Did the philosophers pick it up, from their knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the scriptures because they were well read? Yeah,
Right.
maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe they're just reflecting on the nature of reality.
Right. Simple
You know?
reality is natural law.
Right. Exactly.
And there's going to be overlap, like we've talked about. That's why early Christians adopted Neoplatonic philosophy and vice versa, because they seemed compatible.
Yeah.
Moses and Plato seemed compatible in the first 3 centuries.
There's certainly overlap.
Yeah, in the natural law sense. And I explained this to a friend a couple of weeks ago because somebody did a Bible devotion where they slammed the Stoics and basically said, if you're a Christian, you can't read the Stoics or be a
Mm-hmm.
Stoic. And this person may or may not know me. And I was just like,
Uh-huh.
yeah. And I just said, yeah, they're not the same. They overlap, though.
Mm-hmm.
Same as the first article of the Creed and the third article of the
Well,
Creed
there's no
overlap.
gospel.
Exactly.
There's things that will improve your life,
mm-hmm.
but they're not going to save you.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the overlap. And that's also the dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that natural law is natural law, regardless of whether you're even religious or not. I've read atheists like Christopher Hitchens, for example, towards the end of his life anyways,
Yeah.
who meditated on morality in his own life of debauchery and immorality and cancer. And he has a lot of good things to say about religion and belief and morals and ethics, but yet an atheist.
Right.
And a lot of his critiques of religion, I think, are well-founded. And we should listen to a guy
Really,
like
really
Christopher.
more of a humanist than an atheist at the
Very much
end.
so. Very much so.
Yeah.
But that's not to say then at the end of the day, I can't read Christopher Hitchens, take what he has to say about ethics and morals, weigh that in the balance and say, yeah, he's got something to say about natural law. And yet he rejected the gift of Jesus Christ when it was held out to him by his own brother.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Well, and who was another character that was kind of like this? We followed a journey, Kitchen Confidential, Parts Unknown.
Oh, Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah. Who definitely, yeah, as far as how he lived, it did change over the span of his career.
Right.
He was a hard drinker at the beginning,
Then he became obsessed with jujitsu at the end of his life.
Right. And he was really trying to do better, but he still didn't have hope.
Mm-hmm.
He took his own life. And we don't know mental capacity, illness,
right.
how much all that hard drug use, it does affect you. But that part was sad to see because it did seem he was turning the corner, on taking care of himself, taking care of those around him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it doesn't get you all the way. Can't.
It doesn't. It can help you, like we've talked about, with something like physical activity or exercise, like whether it's jujitsu or biking or CrossFit or even meditation, mindful meditation, where you just sit down and you're still and focus on your breathing.
Or journaling or something. Yeah.
These are helpful things if that's what you're going after. But at the end of the day, like you said, and I explained this in Bible study yesterday when we were talking about God's word is my hope. Like, what does that mean? What do we mean when we say hope? I said, well, you really have to take into consideration then what hopelessness is then as well.
Yeah, it's aimless, right?
Well, in a Hebrew sense, it is. It's hopelessness is when I try to imagine tomorrow, there is no tomorrow. Because David in Psalm 119 is essentially meditating on, my enemies are trying to murder me. The earthly authorities are discrediting me and condemning me. And he basically says, I'm on death's door. My face is in the dirt. I'm in hospice care.
We call this a negative outcome.
Negative outcome. So when he talks about the hopelessness of contemplating his enemies, these earthly authorities who are after him, and where this is leading him, which is to death, he can't imagine tomorrow. He just sees, there's nothing there. There's nothing to imagine. That's hopelessness. There's no aim. There's no goal. When I imagine tomorrow, there's just, I'm going to die. And if not tomorrow, the day after. So there's this nothingness of that comes from a lack of imagination. Because you can't imagine, well, I'm going to plan on this tomorrow. No, you're not, because you're going to be dead. Well, I thought we might go to the zoo. No, you're not going to go to the zoo because they're going to kill you. Versus hope then, and hope in God's word is always, what is it that protects my life? Well, there it is. He says, your word preserves my life. That's my hope. Meaning, I can imagine a tomorrow in spite of my enemies, because your word will preserve my life. So when I imagine tomorrow, it has something to do with you, Lord, and it has something to do with your promise that you've spoken to me, meaning I'm not going to be dead.
Yeah. And if you don't have that, I
Right.
think I might have mentioned this in the last episode. I remember talking about it. You're really paralyzed for fear, right? And that's of course a COVID
Well, I've
situation,
seen
right?
this with Ryan Holiday, for example, who's a famous Stoic
Mm-hmm.
writer in the present tense. And he has definitely turned a corner politically, in my
Yeah.
opinion,
Yeah.
especially since the George Floyd murder, in that as a Stoic, but also as kind of a deistic, general higher power kind of guy when it comes to the God question, he has turned toward another ideology. And then, in my opinion, he has adapted Stoic philosophy to his political ideology.
Right. In
Now, I
regards
would argue the
to
same
the
for myself,
statues and
but
all of those things. Yeah.
and I would actually argue that for me, that Stoic philosophy has made me a kind of quote unquote a more conservative person politically, because I believe in personal responsibility, personal accountability,
Agency. Yeah.
agency, which in the present tense I have been informed by several people makes me conservative. And yet the same guy who wrote one of the books that I've read on Stoicism has gone the other direction politically.
And that it has been incredible to see.
It has. And to your point then, without a very clear and definite definition of, when you say God, what do you mean? When you say Savior,
Mm-hmm.
who are we talking about specifically? Because it's not Jesus. Like, I saw a book on Saturday, Jesus and Buddha, and it's comparing the teachings of the two.
Okay.
And when it comes to, again, first article types of philosophical moral teaching, if we strip away everything else, a la Thomas Jefferson or other deists, Buddha and Jesus have touch points because
Yeah.
they're only speaking about morality.
Golden rule
Now
kind of stuff, right?
right, but if you bring back everything else around those statements, now all of a sudden Jesus' statements, like in the Beatitudes, they're not moral statements, but they're
Mm-hmm.
statements that point to him specifically.
Yeah. And to actual action that he
Right,
does for you.
right.
Yeah.
So for Jesus, the point of his life is, I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many, because I'm the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So the purpose of my relation to Jesus is he's going to do all this for me in order that I might receive enlightenment in a third article sense. In our catechism, we use that word, that the Holy Spirit has called me by the gospel and enlightened me with his gifts. Whereas the Buddha explains enlightenment in terms of agency.
Right.
What I do,
That's the thing when you apply agency to spiritualism, right?
exactly. And
To
I
your
think maybe
relationship.
that kind of thinking it to the point, this scenario point is, Christianity is about instrumentality and what God is doing for us, specifically through his word. Philosophy is the language of agency and what I'm doing for the gods or God through
Mm-hmm.
my own words, my own commitment. That's what the word piety means.
Contemplation. Yeah.
For just Greek philosophy in general, the word piety means discipline.
Mm-hmm.
It's behavior, it's ethics. So when
Well,
we as Christians,
so is religion, right?
exactly,
It's what
yeah,
you do.
religion is ethics. So therefore, if a Christian confuses those two streams, those two conversations, Christianity then becomes ethics, and piety becomes discipline and how you behave, which is essentially what Christianity is in the United States at present, which is why I made the argument 2 weeks ago that the Christian churches in America are spiritually sick,
Yeah.
and have been
What?
for 5 or 6 generations at the minimum.
Right. And I guess we have to say that this idea of instrumentality, that is unfortunately, it's found in early church fathers, but it's
Mhm.
pretty unique to us at this point, to the
I think it's a
Lutheran
Reformation teaching
confession.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it has a lot to do with how, well, if you can listen to Outlaw God Show with your teacher, which we kind of badmouthed in the last episode, but tongue in cheek. He talks
Oh, you
about,
mean Paulson?
I do mean
That
Paulson. Yeah.
hack.
Yeah. 1517 Network Show. Go check it out.
I wouldn't.
Um,
He's barely he's barely intelligible when he talks.
but talking about just words, right?
Yeah.
And that's unique. That's unique. Even not Augustine doesn't even quite have what Luther does with the power of the word.
Right. Mhm.
That there's an immediacy to it.
And there
When
were
God,
certainly plenty of people who attacked Luther for that.
yeah, of course, because they
In
wanted it
fact,
all to be
yeah.
about symbol and about actions and about,
Right.
like, if we go through the motions of, say,
Right.
the Lord's Supper, then it's going to be effective. He's like, Luther's like, no, no, God says it is.
One of
That's
the attacks,
enough.
one of the derogatory terms for the Saxon Reformation was the solaists. Oh,
Mm,
you solaists. Oh, Jesus alone, grace alone. Oh, you people with your loans.
right, and that's that emphasis on instruments that we are given to,
Right.
and that's as we've teased out on the show many times, it doesn't divorce us from love for neighbor that is active,
It
right?
sets us free
Yeah,
to
yeah,
act for our neighbor
right. So
because
when
I'm
we
not
talk,
keeping score anymore.
so when we're talking about like ethical behavior,
Right.
it's not to earn favor for God. I think that's the big
Right.
thing, right?
Which leads us comfortably into Augustine
Mm-hmm.
and where we stopped with love for neighbor in terms of armed conflict.
Hmm. Can you love your neighbor and do war?
Yeah. So Augustine, to kind of backtrack the previous paragraph where we ended, Augustine's distinction between intention and act enabled him to claim that war did not conflict with the Bible. So any hostile act was justifiable, provided it was motivated by charity. That background noise is my oldest son.
Mm-hmm.
The specific precepts were transformed so that love of neighbors could legitimate their deaths, and not to resist evil became an inward attitude compatible with outward belligerence.
Hmm.
And yet, Augustine's exegetical revaluation denied private persons the right to violence. A private Christian could not kill, even in self defense, for that would express hatred. Only responsible public officials were able to do violence without acting out of hatred or other sinful passions.
So the office is the what removal of personal agency, I guess.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the
So,
office buffers your own, personality
mhm.
from the thing that's being done.
Last sentence in this paragraph, Augustine thus joined private pacifism to a justification of public warfare.
So you can be a pacifist and at the same time advocate that the government.
Put
It,
down armed revolution, or there's somebody in your neighborhood who's robbing people at gunpoint.
that does seem to be a paradox. Yeah.
Yes.
How
Well,
can
think
it
of
be
it.
both?
Let's take it in the present context. There is the side that says defund the police,
Mm-hmm.
not reform, defund, take away their money. In my state,
Scale them back severely.
right, Minneapolis City Council voted to abolish the police. They want to abolish the police and then rebuild the police department according to their what they think it should
We're
be.
going to send mental health professionals into dangerous
What,
situations.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, don't get me started. But these are people that all have hired their own private security companies while also getting rid of the police
What?
in
Are you saying
neighborhoods.
there's hypocrisy?
A little bit.
Don't.
They don't even
Oh.
live in Minneapolis. Anyways, so think about it in terms though, if you say, well, we need to defund the police or abolish the police
Mm-hmm.
or severely limit the police's reach in
Jurisdiction.
terms jurisdiction, thank you. Yeah. And we're going to put limitations on the kind of force they can use, when they can use it, how they can use it, all
Could be
these things.
could be like UK, right, where they can't even carry
Right. You can't
weapons.
carry a gun. You can't carry a weapon. So then what happens in the United States currently, at least where I live at in Minnesota in the upper Midwest, is that I'm semi-rural, 40 minutes from downtown Minneapolis. Like I've said, the most liberal person where I live at has 3 guns.
Mm-hmm.
And the attitude is like, if you bring that here, there's not going to be yelling. There's not going to be finger pointing. We're not going to mace you. We're not going to call the police. We're going to put you down.
Yeah.
And essentially in my area, that's kind of the police's attitude is like, you come on a person's lawn and you start throwing Molotov cocktails or you start trying to burn down the local church or whatever, and we're not there and they're shooting, you know, play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
But
Whereas
Augustine's saying here you can't even fight
you
back.
can't do that. Exactly. Yeah. Because maybe I'm wrong, but he's defining the vocation, the office, very narrowly. If you're a police officer or a soldier, that's an office, and you're called into that office in which you serve. And therefore, those who are not in that specific office and are not called into that service, therefore, should not act violently towards someone in their neighborhood if they, someone's trying to mug their neighbor out in front of their house or something,
Right.
because
Well,
that would be hatred.
right. We're not anarchists. And I don't think I think that
classically defined or just
well,
generally?
yeah, right. Um, but if you look at the way that say Luther exegetes Genesis, he,
Hmm.
he right from the get go with Adam and then into the
Right.
patriarchs, he's seeing public
Yes. Right.
offices
Yeah.
that are growing out of really the first public office is that of the family and the head
Hmm.
of the household, the father,
Right.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
he's seeing other offices, say of civil ruler, king comes
Hmm.
out of that,
Hmm.
but also the protective offices like a soldier.
Right.
That's actually they're doing the job of the father in
Right.
his stead. So
Mhm.
for me, the question is here: well, what happens when those in public office fail to do their job?
Right.
It is the house, the head of the household's duty to take up the job that's
Well,
being
here's the
neglected.
question with Luther, because he flips that hierarchy from, so
Oh, that's
that's
right.
what I'm wondering
Yeah.
with Augustine. Is it the
Ah,
priesthood, the politician, and the family? Parents come last in that, vocational order, because Luther puts it's parents, then politicians, then priests, which
yeah.
is weird because according to his Genesis lectures, it goes parents, prophet,
Hmm.
then in Genesis 11, the earthly government's established.
The government comes later. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's last.
So even Luther kind of changes and modifies that as he goes. Well,
Well, because
Genesis at
the
the end of his
office of the
life, but
prophet is preaching of law, but it's law and
right,
gospel,
right,
whereas the civil estate is law.
yeah,
There's no gospel,
right.
and the parents obviously have both law and gospel. So, hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I bet. I mean, if you just think of Augustine's own life and the way that
Hmm.
he did not prioritize family,
Right.
either his own personal family or taking care of.
Well,
Didn't
yeah,
he
that's
have
a whole.
children out of wedlock?
He did
And
with his concubine.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and married late, and yeah.
Hmm.
So
It is a
I
strange thing because at least at that time, the Romans had legions in every major city in the empire, from Britain to the Middle East to North Africa to the Germanic tribes in the north. There were Roman legions everywhere. There were police forces in like Rome, for example,
but not like what we
Alexandria.
have here.
No, not even comparable.
There was a necessity
I mean, they're
for like
basically the local militia,
I was going to say there's going to be community defense
kind of like the Old
organizations.
West here in the United States with the sheriff and the deputy, and then you would deputize a posse and go out and chase cattle rustlers or
Pick some
something.
guys, yeah, authorize
Yeah,
them and send them. Yeah.
yeah. And in the present tense, like where I live at, if I do a 911 call, it would probably take the police anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to get to my house,
Hmm.
depending on where they're at
Just
geographically.
geography. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not waiting 10 to 20 minutes for someone to show up if it's imminent
You
danger.
probably don't have 10 or 20
But
minutes.
here's the question then, is he, no, you definitely don't. You
Well,
have
think about a
3.
fire, right? You got a
Yeah.
fire, you're going to
Yeah.
wait, or are you going to get
Yeah.
the
Just
fire
stand there.
extinguisher? Yeah.
A private Christian could not kill even in self-defense because that would express hatred, which is interesting because I don't agree with that in the least, actually.
Now, do you think that's a fair estimation of Augustine by this author?
Well, we'd have
That,
to read against Faustus, which is what he's citing.
right.
And he's actually citing Libero Arbitrio against Julian of McClellan there. So on the
Hmm.
bondage of the will.
Right. Well,
So
but I think it's consistent with Augustine in his
mhm,
term and his thought of office
yeah.
and the way that he works on that.
And
So,
by hatred, this is like we talked about in the last episode. For Augustine, original sin is concupiscence in the sense of
oh yeah,
misordered love. It doesn't have to do with faith. It has to do primarily with love and the failure to love God and to love your neighbors yourself. When I, that's the thing is that if I, if someone tries to start a fight with me in a parking lot, for example, as has happened, and I just listen, I look and go, yeah, sure, okay. Because it's not me personally they're attacking. I just happen
hmm,
to be there at that moment. They're having a bad day or something. So what he's saying to me isn't true. So why do I care what he's saying to me? He's not moving toward me. He's not threatening me. I'm not with my kids or my wife or anything like that. It's just this person, I'm in their way. They're yelling at me for this reason. Okay, fine, cool. I'm whatever you say I am. Cool. Live
yeah,
and let live.
yeah,
I'm loving you as my neighbor. Because if I was in a bad spot and I got out my car and started ranting like a maniac, I wouldn't want you to shoot me or mace me or something like that or call the police. So you know what? Just get it out. Get it out. I am your backstop for your rage and anger right now. Just get it out. I forgive you. On the other hand, if my 8-year-old's with me and he starts moving toward me, now we have a problem
yeah. That's right.
because I'm going to protect my 8-year-old no matter what. But I'm not doing it because I hate the person who's threatening me. I'm doing it because I love my 8-year-old.
I think that's the key. We're talking about motive here,
Yeah.
and I think Augustine's reflecting on probably Sermon on the Mount
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about turning the other cheek and
Yeah. Yeah.
whatnot there.
100%.
And individually, that's almost always true.
Mm-hmm.
And it is probably best, if you're going to, go and have a war, that it
Yeah.
be done. Well, it's going to be moderated if it's done through the office, through
Right.
public office. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we just don't go to. Well, actually, we do, but um, we try not to just go to war without authorization from at least from Congress, right? Although all that stuff has changed now, I suppose. Yeah, unfortunately, right? But it used to be. It used to be, that you would have the support of the elected officials.
The
You'd be
will of the
author.
people, I think, was a little bit more relevant
Right, exactly.
because those are the people that you wanted to march.
Well, that's true,
Where I think
especially
in the
if you're going
present
to.
tense, military service is such a specialized vocation nowadays.
When was the last draft? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but if you're going to draft people, you have to have the support of the people.
Right.
At
Well, I
least
knew
if you're
people, you and I
wise.
both know people that were in the military before September 11th,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a great career path, and they had a calling for it. And then afterwards they deployed 4, 5, 13 times. And now they're saying, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. And the military said, yeah, you did.
Yeah. Be careful
You
what
go where
you.
we tell you. That's the
Yeah.
way it is.
Yeah. It's true.
But yet
So
it is a calling. It is a specialized vocation in the present tense. We don't have a warrior class like Augustine would have seen every day. In Rome, that was kind of your way out of poverty. Like if you were a poor kid growing up on the streets and you wanted a way out and an upward career path, the military is pretty much one of the best ways out.
true that.
And it still is to this day. I know plenty of people who grew up in really bad situations that joined the military when they were 17, 18
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't have the grades, they didn't have the opportunities or resources to succeed. They saw the military as a way out of their life and they thrived as a consequence.
Yeah. There is a degree of aptitude that's required there, and there's certainly
Hmm.
physical one.
Yeah.
And but I don't. It's not that that's a low standard. It's just it's not academic.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Only
so it may be
responsible
doable.
public officials are able to do violence.
I know what he's going for here,
Hmm.
and I know what we're getting hung up on, which is even in self defense.
Right. It is
Um,
really that point, isn't it?
it is, but on the other hand, I just don't see how it does. It does seem to be there's a dichotomy, right? Where
Yeah.
on the one hand, the individual normally isn't responsible for this,
Hmm.
but there are going to be cases. Maybe that's what it is. He's pretty cut and dry here,
Yeah.
black and white, and it's not always that clear. There
Right.
there are times where I guess we wouldn't call it a war, but we call it like microaggression or something. Okay. There are times where aggression is called for in defense of your
Hmm.
neighbor,
Hmm.
and to say that that's never possible because
Right.
then you would violate this principle of hatred.
Well,
I'm
think
just
about it
not
this way
sure.
too. In the United States, we have this Second Amendment that is a hot topic most of the time.
Yep.
And people like to carry guns, whether concealed or open carry, rifles in their car, whatever it might be.
Hmm.
In Rome, if you carried a sword or a spear around in the street and you weren't a soldier or you weren't authorized to do that, you're in trouble. Like we were talking about in Great Britain.
So
Not even
this
the police are allowed to carry guns.
so maybe the easiest way to go with this is that Augustine is reflecting his cultural setting.
Up until Caesar, like they weren't like even soldiers weren't allowed to carry their weapons in Rome within the walls of the city.
Oh,
That's kind of how he took over. He just walked in and went, I'm in charge. And they went, you're breaking the law. There's no weapons allowed inside the city limits. He's like, okay, well, stop me.
it's a whole deal with Brutus, right?
Right. Yeah. It's like, I've
Like,
got all the
what? Brutus has
weapons.
a weapon?
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
So there's that aspect of it too, of just precedent, culture, context. I get it. But at the same time, like we said, look at Abraham
Yeah, right.
as an example. And here's the nut now, because and this is we kind of set this up inadvertently by talking about it, but I mentioned in passing when Augustine debates Julian of Eclanum, they're both Cicero scholars. They both love Cicero, who's a Neoplatonic. And here's why this is important. Then when we were talking about Stoic philosophy, for example, and overlap, Augustine's formula for the just war is adapted from Cicero. Appears only once. Quote, just wars are usually defined as those that avenge injuries.
Hmm.
That's from Cicero. A
So
lot of Augustine's theology is informed by Cicero.
you can't. There's no preemptive strike here.
Right. Yeah. This isn't Minority Report.
Right. This is only in response to injuries already inflicted
Correct.
against you, and then
Right.
avenging that. Okay.
Yeah. No, we need to hit them before they hit us kind of attitude.
Mm-mm.
War was justifiable, quote, when a people or a city neglected either to punish wrongs done by its members or to restore what it had wrongly seized.
Okay. So again, there's wrong that's already been accomplished or already done,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and from Augustine's formula, the just war is only that which is done in response to the
Right.
evil already what do you want to say? Perpetuated. That's it.
Perpetrated,
Perpetrated.
but
That's the right
also
word.
then not done in hatred or rage. But as we talked about in the last episode, you basically need to do this with a kind of sad lamentation. You
Yeah.
should lament over the
Well,
fact
even
that
the
you have
word
to do this.
avenge. I mean, how are you going to do avenge with emotional neutrality?
Right, right. We'll call ourselves the Revengers.
I didn't really want to do this, but since you did it to me, I have
Yeah, this
to.
hurts
I'm
me
so
more than it
sad.
hurts you.
There you go. That's it.
This terse explanation, war is justifiable when a people or a city neglected either to punish wrongs done by its members or to restore what it had wrongly seized. This explanation admitted varying interpretations.
Hmm.
In a narrow view, violation of rights legitimated a war, limited to redress of grievances by the injured party, a simple return to the status quo ante bellum. A broader view made the just war a means of punishing not only crimes, but sins. That is, it could also avenge moral faults and need not be limited in its use of violence, such as the Crusades. It could be
Mm.
waged by any legitimate authority acting as a defender of the moral order or of a Christian doctrine.
Oh my.
Exactly.
So there are those that took what Augustine said and made it much more broadly
Right.
applied.
Right.
So if we saw, let's think of a contemporary example. If we
Well, I
saw,
could turn the entire Middle East to glass.
right, well, some kind of human rights violation, right?
Sure. Human trafficking in India.
Okay. Or I was thinking, where was one of these genocides?
Darfur.
Okay. So we can get involved in that because there's great moral,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Rwanda. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I mean, people killing each other that shouldn't be.
Right. And
And
it
so
was
we're going
Muslims killing Christians
to, well, yeah, that was true too.
specifically.
Yeah.
So we
That,
double whammy. It's Christian doctrine and it's morally evil.
right. But you mentioned the Crusades, and those were, tooled as evangelistic.
Right. Yeah. It's evangelism.
I know we're being a little bit critical, from a great distance now, but yeah, I know we're going to go convert those regions,
Mm-hmm.
to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That was the idea. You saw the Hagia Sophia; they're having Muslim worship services in there again.
No kidding.
Yeah, it remains with its status as a museum,
Right.
and yet they're praying the hours in there now.
Well, here's a good distinction of what we've been talking about. So I can say, because we've said it, that Islam is a Christian heresy and it should be condemned as such. It's false doctrine. And we've gone through why. Denial of Christ's divinity, so forth and so on.
What was our episodes? We had John of Damascus, right?
Yeah, John of Damascus.
Yeah.
Good
Go
stuff.
find that.
On the flip side, currently in China, there's a genocide being committed against Muslims. And there's video evidence of this now. This isn't a theory. It's not a reporter or some defector or some spy. There's actual video evidence that's available online.
And probably far worse than anything that's happening to Christians in China.
Far worse.
Yeah.
Actually, because at least in China, Christianity, as long as it's approved by the state, you're okay. And I think you and I both know a lot of Christians who are
underground, yeah.
English teachers.
Yeah, there's ways around it.
There's ways around it. But nonetheless, as a Christian, in the first article sense, I can also look at those same Muslims and say, well, that's evil. And it needs to stop. And we need to do something about this. And not turn a blind eye to it, because you're committing genocide against a group of people because they're Muslims, because of their religion.
Yeah.
And it's horrific what they're doing. So on the one hand, I can say, I condemn you for false teaching. However, I will also stand between you and the person perpetrating this violence against you, because this is morally wrong.
Isn't that interesting?
Augustine would disagree with me. He would actually say, no, we have to send in the military.
Right. But he would also be like, why are you going to defend a Muslim?
A Muslim, exactly.
How can they be your neighbor?
Right.
because they're obviously heretical, in their
Mm-hmm.
belief. And then also, maybe what he does is, yeah, maybe reading too much into Augustine, but he's conflating um, belief and morality.
Well, I was going to say I think he's confusing law and law. It's not law
Uh,
gospel confusion, it's a law confusion.
yeah.
There's theological. The
Hmm.
law is a theological condemning us and pointing us to Christ, but then the law in the moral naturalistic sense. Like
Right.
love your neighbor as you want to be loved.
Right. And
I would,
that can
yeah,
actually be a kind of a soft apologetic for
I think so.
your faith.
Hmm.
That's where Paul goes, right? Where is that in
Hmm.
Timothy? He says, "Be
Right,
prepared to make a defense
right.
for the hopes that's in you."
And
And
this
like, wait
goes
a minute,
back to
yeah.
what we said earlier of if I talk about Christians who stood up for Jews in Denmark, for example, in the 40s,
Oh, that's a great
and
example. Yeah.
they stood with those Jews and they said, "We don't care if you're a Christian, if you convert or not. This is evil. And as a Christian, I'm commanded by my Lord to love you, be compassionate, to harbor you and shelter you because the Nazis are satanic. They're antichrist. They've set themselves up as a false religion, literally. They're satanic. Communist China, satanic. They set themselves up as an antichrist because they're anti-Christ.
They
And the only
are,
churches that are
absolutely.
allowed to exist in China are those that have a state message.
Yeah.
They're allowed to,
And
yeah,
also immoral.
and terribly immoral. If you're raping Muslim women and girls because they're Muslims in order to quote unquote convert them,
Right.
and you're loading up men on into boxcars, actual trains, and shipping them off to factories to make Nike shoes and Apple phones, P.S.,
Mm-hmm.
that's evil.
Right. Never mind like human experimentation.
Oh, there's that too, right? And
Yeah.
organ harvesting. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
So I make this point because I think we need to face this reality. There's a lot of people, Christians included, who say, well, if I was alive in 1939, I would have stood up and harbored Jews and sheltered Jews and hidden Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have stood up to the Nazis and risked my own life and the life of my family to do that. Well, it's happening right now.
Or if I were in the 19th century, I would have been part of the Underground Railroad, and I would
Right,
have been
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
freeing
exactly.
slaves, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Whereas these things are happening right now. And so far, the response has not been very widespread. Mainstream media saying nothing about this.
Right.
People online, if they know about it, they're speaking up about it. But at the same time, like I said, if I as a Christian, I'll post a video on my Instagram today. I will have people ask, but you're a Christian. It's like, yeah, but I also have friends who are Muslims.
Right.
And
Yeah.
who cares if I know people who are Muslim and I can sympathize with Chinese Muslims? That's genocide. It's the same thing with when Rwanda happened and
Mm-hmm.
speaking up about that and saying to friends of mine, these are Christians who are being slaughtered in their churches
Right.
by Muslims who are basically being allowed by the government to do this and to commit this genocide.
Well, you have a
And we're
similar
not doing
thing.
anything.
What was it? Nigeria. Yeah, I saw this
Mm-hmm.
this morning. Um, whereas 5 Christian men,
Mm-hmm.
were killed by Muslims. So it works. I mean, it works
Right.
from many angles. It's like,
Yeah.
no, you're free to be a Muslim. You're not free to go kill what you call the infidel.
Right.
What do we call it? That would be, what do they call the radical Muslims or something?
What's
Versus
jihad?
moderate. Yeah, jihadists.
Yeah.
And you get it from the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
You can choose to ignore that part of the Quran if you want to.
Right.
I mean, there's different
But
people
that's
do
a good
different things.
point that John Damascus makes is jihad is essentially when I read the Old Testament and I read it the opposite of what Augustine here says.
Mm-hmm.
But yet we know, like we talked about with the Middle Ages and how you can take this just war theory and spin it up and make it into the Crusades. Both sides, the Turk and the European Christian, are waging a jihad against the other side and calling it, a religious
Well, I
war.
mean, arguably, what Israel does to Canaan,
Mm-hmm.
um, I mean, they're not killing the inhabitants of Canaan because they're, um, you know, just there. They're killing
Right.
them
Yeah.
because they're unbelievers,
Right.
and that's, I mean, that justification is what God Himself gives them from day
Right.
one. Is like, you can't have these idolaters where you're living, and
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to marry them, and then you're
Mm-hmm.
going to bring idolatry into your home, and you're going to undermine the faith.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're like, and we don't have to like that, but it
Right.
seems like Islam does reflect that.
Yeah.
The jihadists do anyway.
So it is interesting how this spins itself out in Western history,
Isn't that
even
something?
in the examples we just used between Islam and Christianity.
Just spin it up big time into like defending moral order or
Mhm.
Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
that's a just cause
Yeah.
to go to war, but only not as individuals again, as
Mm-hmm.
a within an office.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Augustine did not elucidate the kinds of guilt that would justify warfare, though. He did argue, on the strength of Numbers chapter 21 and Joshua chapter 8,
There it is.
that
Yep.
any war waged on divine command was a just war, in which warriors, acting out of obedience and without sinful libido, were absolved of fault. Libido in the sense of I lust for
Passion.
death.
Yeah, I lost passion. So yes, it may be considered murder, but it's not because God told them to. So it's
Correct.
forgiven, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Wise men waged just wars only when required by the iniquity of the enemy.
Mm.
This is in City of God, by the way. Defense of the patria, the fatherland, the homeland, its citizens and property, was a just cause, as was denial of the right of innocent passage.
What does he mean by that? Right of innocent
Remember
passage.
when we read Luther on the Jews?
Oh,
And he
yeah,
said
that's
that if you
right.
see Jews on the road, attack them.
Ah, okay. So this is
I
highway
think that's
robbery. Yeah,
Well, I
okay.
think that's what he means, is that you don't have the right of innocent passage because you are.
If you deny somebody the right of that
Mhm.
there's a just war there.
Yeah.
Okay. Huh. So required iniquity of the enemy. So again, it's always responsory though. It
Mhm.
looks like from Augustine.
Yeah.
At least
I, I,
from him, from his own writing.
the
Yes,
assumption
others.
being, I think, that if I attack you, it's out of hatred or sinful libido.
Mhm.
Therefore, the response to that attack is just because I'm fighting against hatred and sinful libido.
Oh, I see.
I'm fighting against original sin, essentially,
Hmm.
concupiscence.
Yeah. Huh.
The just war must be waged only by legitimate authority. There it is. Also, Augustine held that the emperor represented God, the king's two bodies kind of thing.
Right.
He's emperor because he's been ordained by God to be the emperor. So therefore, if he says it, it's legitimate.
Well, that's a New Testament idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
That all authority
Romans
is given
12.
by God. Yeah.
Right. So the ruler then had the primary responsibility to decide whether recourse to war was just and necessary, and the soldiers were to obey unless the prince's orders clearly violated divine precepts. When a soldier killed, he was not guilty of murder, and if he refused, he was guilty of treason. Again, City of God, against Faustus, his commentary on the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
In discussing authority, Augustine naturally turned to God, who caused defeats to fulfill his promises to his chosen people. Divine authority made exceptions to its own prohibitions on killing. There it is. This bellum deo auctore was an easy way to justify warfare. Augustine's use of Old Testament wars as instruments of divine punishment functioned as a deus ex machina that even justified the use of ambushes and other stratagems. God's role meant that Augustine's just war was permeated with divine activity, which encouraged later notions of holy war. There you go.
All right. So as long as you had God on your side, then it was just.
Yeah.
And the king, divinely appointed, or
Mhm.
Caesar in his case, but
Right.
yeah, he's divinely appointed. So that means you have God on your side.
Well, think of the famous portrait of John Brown.
I don't
With
know this.
him. So John Brown is Harper's Ferry and everything that kind of led up to the Civil War popping
Mm-hmm.
off. And
Right.
John Brown makes up his mind, I've basically been ordained by God to set these people free and liberate this fort. And there's this famous painting of John Brown then, where John Brown's like 12 feet tall, and he's got a gun held out in one arm, a rifle, and he looks like Moses. He looks like an Old Testament prophet.
Hmm.
And then everybody else in the picture is like half his size. And it's this very powerful imagery of John Brown, but also the dynamics of that moment and his decision. But he essentially, right, wrong, or mentally ill, was like, yeah, God basically told me I got to do this.
This is kind of like those, I guess they're memes or their artwork where the president's riding a dinosaur with an American
Yeah,
flag and a
absolutely.
machine gun.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Right.
Bald eagle on his
If Trump
shoulder.
if Trump wins re-election, I would hope the first thing he hangs in the Oval Office is that portrait.
One of those.
Him
Well, I was
riding
thinking
a
of the
yeah,
Reagan ones, but yeah,
him riding a
okay.
T-Rex with an American flag and a laser beam or something, or riding a shark, riding a on top of a bear, riding a shark with yeah. But the way it spins itself out then is interesting to me in the sense that, like we've been discussing, you can push this pretty far because it is kind of vague and ambiguous.
Yeah. Well, and like the author suggests, Augustine's got one mention, of that, even that term just war, and then it becomes a whole school of thought, right? A
Yeah.
philosophy, from just a casual mention, basically quoting Cicero.
Right. Well, I talked about this in Bible study again yesterday in relation to Psalm 119 and his response to his enemies, because we discussed it on this podcast last week of thou shalt not murder is very simple and very comprehensive. Don't murder people.
There's no like out except when
there's no second degree manslaughter.
but
don't murder people. That's what I think of when I read stuff like this is you read the command against murder, and then the old Adam, the sinner, says, okay, we gotta figure out a workaround for this.
There's got to be a way to kind of, okay, so it's not murder if there's no hatred. Okay,
Right.
that works. And you never, I mean, even a soldier, there's never any hatred, right? Because they're just fulfilling their office. Like,
right.
Obviously, you've never been a soldier. Some soldiers are maniacs, right? I mean, they're just bloodlust, whatever. It's there. Does that mean they're not doing? They're not acting justly, and they're not doing God's work? Yeah, that's a question, isn't it?
And well, for Augustine, because it's within the context of their vocation, it is godly and it's not murder.
Yeah. The underlying current, which we've talked about quite a bit in a lot of context, is that Augustine has this idea that there's a pure motive. That you can have pure motives. You can have a pure heart or something. You can act justly. And we are like, no, we've read Romans.
Right.
And no, we can't do anything without sin. It's we're never pure in that. I mean, the idea of going into war, where did he say it? And you're absolved of fault? Yeah, up at the top of the page there.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually necessary because you have sinful libido all the time.
Right. Well, it's a very practical argument when we talk about war crimes, for example, and a soldier or a group of soldiers is put on trial for murder, like My Lai in Vietnam. These people are going to be put on trial for committing murder during a war, right? And George Carlin Community has a very famous comment that I can't repeat on a family-friendly show, but basically it's,
that's crazy, right?
It's crazy, yeah. But at the same time, if we apply Augustine's just war theory, you're walking through a village, you decide this village is harboring Viet Cong, so we're just going to burn your village to the ground, even though we have no evidence whatsoever that there's anybody here. And Jordan Peterson talks about this as a test case for authority and hierarchies, because the helicopter pilot tries to drop his helicopter between the village and the soldiers, his own soldiers, and ultimately has to call in to headquarters and say, this is what's happening. And then the colonel says to the squad leader, knock it off. And he says, okay. And they just all stop.
Yeah, right.
And then they're put on trial later for murder. And it is that within the context, I just talked to somebody about this on Saturday, within the context of conflict, the leader is not allowed to take the moral low ground. And I talked about this with Sean Parental and Outlaw Platoon. The leader has to remain emotionally in control when the people around him want to act out of hatred, act out of that lust for revenge. He's got to hold the line, because if they descend into that pit, into that darkness, as Sean explains, he recognized that moment, they're not going to come back out.
So it's kind of the difference between, I don't know, leading at the front and just like unleashing the dogs of war, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just go do your war thing versus, no, actually, I'm going to be out in front so that I'm always aware of the situation. I see what's happening. They're following me rather than I'm like just following pushing from the back
literally.
and just letting them loose.
Yeah. Whereas Jocko would say lead from third or fourth from the front, so you can kind of assess everything.
Right. But yeah, if you're unaware, well, I've talked about that with Vietnam, right? And how there are people making decisions and they're on the other side of the Pacific and they're not even actively engaged in what's going on. They're just making,
It's
It's like,
like we were talking, it's the accountants versus the engineers.
I'm gonna say you're throwing money at a problem, but you're
Right.
actually throwing humans at the problem.
Right.
Mm.
And we would argue at the time, as many people did, that that was not a just war, and we had no legitimate authority for being there. We had no plan for victory, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been thousands of books written on this topic. But
It
at
was
the end of
under the guise of a moral cause, right?
right. Yeah.
Or a political moral cause, I
Well, we got to
suppose,
stop
even more
communism,
specific. Yeah, stop
the
communism.
Red Threat, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Right.
So as a consequence, I'm going to skip down to this last paragraph then. It is possible to reduce Augustine's just war to 3 simple criteria. So for those of you listening, write this down.
This is it.
Next time you need to go to war. 1, legitimate authority, including God. However, conditionally, going back to John Brown basically thought that God told him to go shoot people because
Yeah.
slavery was the greatest moral and spiritual evil that was essentially, you couldn't call America God's country or refer to us as God's people if slavery was still slavery and black people were still being enslaved, Africans.
It does kind of have a point.
He does, 100%. The way he went about it might have been a little wrong-headed. But then I think Augustine's counter to that would have been, that's why John Brown was shot.
Okay.
Because he met with Frederick Douglass before this happened. And Frederick Douglass listened and said, I agree with your thesis, but I can't go forward with what you're proposing because, well, if I'm there, they're just going to slaughter thousands and thousands of black people.
Yeah. Well, it is a difference between, I guess, in today's terms, it'd be liberal and conservative, but, the conservative warfare is the one where it's going to be waged maybe in a much more deliberate and cautious and maybe, I guess, long haul kind of way. We talked about that in terms of like resolving a foreign conflict, is that this can take generations in cases. Whereas, the more liberal guys, person is going to come in and say, we're just going to fix, the surface level problem, and then we're just going to get out. Like, but you're not actually reforming anything. You're just leaving things to devolve back into what they were. And so, I think you and I would be more interested in resolving conflict with legislation, if possible, and other kinds of, I guess, they're less active warfare. I'm thinking domestically. I'm not thinking internationally.
Well, but a law is only enforceable when there is the threat of violence behind it.
Yeah, that's true. There's always a threat of violence. Yeah.
Those who demand that we defund the police then go out and riot and burn down buildings and attack police officers and federal agents, or establish their own police force, such as like CHAZ, CHOP, these kinds of things.
Or a passive, or what was it? Oh, a peaceful protest that somehow managed to burn the courthouse.
Super peaceful.
What?
We see this, though, that regardless of what side of the argument you're on, there's still violence that has to be brought into the scenario, because either side's going to say, no, I don't think so. We're not going to do that.
You think it's too bold to call that warfare? I think I see it as, I know there are people saying we're in the midst of, or the beginnings of, a civil war. It's just a different kind of warfare, if you're going to call it that, right? It's not clearly like battle lines
we're shooting
drawn
at each other.
Well, I know, that's what I mean. It's more guerrilla, I guess, and localized.
Right, but that's the point, is that if the federal government sent out the actual military, not the National Guard, because that's under the governor's authority, but if Trump just decided and Congress went along with it, like, we're just going to send the military into these cities.
We've never done that, right? With the exception of being the Civil War.
There's been different times, actually. That's where the term red tape comes from, actually.
Okay.
Where the president sent the military to put down rioters, protesters, these
domestically. Okay.
Yeah, domestically. We just don't talk about it in school.
Well, it's kind of last resort, right?
It's a black eye kind of thing. But think about actually the movie Gangs of New York. They portray that.
Oh yeah.
Where, hey, we're not going to fight in the Civil War. It's not our war. We're not fighting. And then the military had to go out and literally like drag people to the polling, or to the recruitment office. Yeah, to conscript them. So we've done it. And that's why they fought in the streets, and that's why there was war in the streets. I think we tend to, in my opinion, use the term violent conflict rather than war, because we don't like the term, because it's a pretty, that's pretty monolithic, and it carries a lot of baggage with it.
Well, let's use an example. So, say you had a business, small business in CHAZ, whatever it ended up being called, right? And it was completely destroyed as a result.
Right.
That's obviously you've sustained an injury. That was an injury to personal property, possession, livelihood, right? Is there a legitimate authority that was whose job it was to protect you in that case? Yeah, there was.
Constitutionally, yes.
Well, not just constitutionally. I mean, just civilly in the local community. I mean, the Seattle Police Department, that was their job. They were told not to do their job.
Correct.
Okay.
Actually, the Portland police just published that last night or this morning. The same thing, same letter.
Okay,
We've
so
been
now
told by the city council to not do our jobs. So don't call us because we won't respond.
So how do you avenge that injury?
Right.
Because I do think you have the right to avenge that injury.
Well, that is the point. Over the weekend, somebody put out a study that if you compare Detroit to Baghdad, you're actually safer in Baghdad than Detroit.
It's like true. the Babylon Bee, something like Americans not happy with, or it was Chicago people. Chicagoans moving to more peaceful land of the Middle East.
Right. But that was this author's point in this article was the death rate, the murder rate in Detroit, the murder rate is higher in Detroit than Baghdad. So you're safer joining the military and being deployed to Iraq than you are staying in Detroit.
Incredible.
And we know about the water in Flint and all these other things.
Yeah.
In Michigan, by the way, Detroit's in Michigan, for those of you who forgot. Where you at one time you couldn't buy seeds for your garden.
Where'd they think it was? Oh, you're saying Michigan because of the totalitarian governor. Got it. Okay.
I didn't say that. You said
that.
Oh,
oops.
I'm not allowed to pontificate anymore. So
no, that's right. Keep it to yourself.
The point is that if we just go with one, the first simple criteria for just war is legitimate authority. Who determines whether that authority is legitimate or not?
Yeah. Can a man stand in front of his business with, an assault rifle or whatever it was?
Like the Koreans in LA.
Oh, did they?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I have friends that have gyms out in LA and they're like, remember after the Rodney King verdict and
that's right.
Koreans up on the roof,
right.
And then they put a side by side with Koreans during the riots in this past month. And they're like, those Koreans,
they're not going to let you.
They're always ready to throw down.
So when the legitimate authority drops the ball,
right.
And it's either that or you sustain injury, do you have a right? But again, that's self-defense too, which Augustine, at least according to this author, is not so big in.
No.
Which is something.
Although I guess what you could do then if you feel threatened is go and join the army and then come back home.
Oh, now you have a legitimate authority.
And then you have legitimate authority.
Ah, okay. Well, we would argue though that maybe not self-defense, but defense of, say, your children. That's no longer self-defense. That's within your authority.
Right.
As a parent, you can defend your kids.
Right.
Yeah, and whatever. I mean, you'll go to jail if you have to, for whatever excessive force or something.
Right.
If it comes down to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Number 2, then, the just cause of avenging injuries and religious intention.
That's the third, then, is religious intention.
So the second is just cause of avenging injuries.
So it has to be responsory.
It has to be, and then finally, righteous intention. Yeah, it has to be righteous.
Meaning your heart's in the right spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which I'm just not, I just can't. I understand what he's going for, and I think it's good. Again, like I mentioned, Sermon on the Mount. But I think it's a little naive to say that you're always going to be completely righteous in your intent.
Yeah. Well, I think we would argue he doesn't have the lowest anthropology at this point. Later in his career, he definitely had a low anthropology when he gets to double predestination. No, actually, he doesn't. No, I take that back.
No.
Because in order for double predestination to work, you have to have a relatively, at least moderate anthropology, because there is some work involved there.
Yeah, there's righteous people.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's where it falls apart at then, is that he doesn't go deep enough into original sin and the human heart.
Yeah, and we would argue, I think, give peace a chance is a lie, right? I mean, I love the idea of peace. I pray for peace, but I think it's actually going to be God's doing, and
That's a great point, though, and maybe we should discuss that for a second. Because I was thinking about this over the weekend, I made a point about this on the podcast that only those who are schooled and trained in violence can actually bring true peace.
Because they withhold the violence.
Because that's the definition of meekness. To be meek is to know how to use a sword, but you choose to keep it sheathed for the sake of the neighbor. Is that we've talked about this. If you're familiar, if you're schooled in violence, if you're trained in violence, like I said with Kevin Ross, he's a world-class fighter. He's a world champion. He's one of the most humble people who took the time just to respond to me, a nobody, just because that's the person he is.
Yeah.
And outside the ring, like all of my favorite fighters outside of the ring, they're the most peaceful, humble, compassionate people you'll ever meet. Thoughtful, intelligent, well-spoken.
They keep it where it belongs, in other words.
Exactly. That's why, like in the UFC, most UFC fighters who are not mentally ill, they never
From
fight outside.
Ireland, you mean? Oh,
or
sorry.
Florida.
Or Florida. Yeah, there's
Mike
another
Perry
one.
beat up an old guy, but they don't fight outside the ring because it's their job and they're familiar with violence and they know the consequences.
Keep it
But also they're
professional.
being
Yeah.
paid. They won't even get into fights with other fighters outside of the ring because their attitude is like, well, I'm not going to fight you if it's not for money. What's the point?
When it's
Because it's
not
their
my job. Yeah, right.
It's like I tell students, especially new students when I'm teaching, there's no check on the table. So tap often, admit you were defeated, start over. You're not losing face in here by admitting that you lost that round or you lost
You're
that.
learning. That's what you're doing.
Learning.
Yeah.
And part of learning is learning not to let the person who is with you break some part of you.
Yeah. Fail gracefully.
And so I always say there's no check on the table. If you pass out to that rear naked choke, I'm not giving you a check for $5,000. It's not there. But people tend to come in with that attitude like, I'm fighting for my life. I'm fighting to win. It's like, that's actually not the reason you're here. Because if you carry that attitude out into the world, and now all of a sudden every confrontation you have out there in the world is, I gotta engage in this confrontation to win, to be right, you're gonna get hurt. Or you're gonna hurt other people worse. Versus if you're schooled in violence, if you're trained in violence and you comprehend the consequences of violence, you're gonna lean toward peace. But also then other people recognize, okay, this is not someone I want to mess with. It's like we talk about,
right.
If you see someone with cauliflower ears, that's nature's way of saying, don't mess with this person.
Yeah, there's a threat of violence there.
So therefore you say, I'm not going to mess with this person. And that's why, in a way, I'm kind of for open carry, because I'm like, if I see that you have a gun, I'm less likely to mess with you.
It is interesting. I mean, I was driving the car, we're visiting family, and I was just thinking about how there's like a social contract when you're driving, right? I mean, you're really driving a pretty violent weapon in a way.
Right,
it could be
2,000-pound bullet.
Right. I mean, it could turn into a really terrible, life-changing, life-destroying event. And you trust everybody else out on the road, which is pretty incredible when you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a similar thing with the Second Amendment and carrying is that, there's going to be exceptions. There's going to be places where people are irresponsible, drunk drivers, whatever, in the case of guns, not well trained, don't know what they're doing, and don't know how to keep it sheathed, right?
Right.
As you said with the sword. What's that? We do have a common expression though, pick your battle.
Yeah.
And that's not referring to actual warfare. That's referring to not every conflict is worth engaging.
That's what I tell we teach our kids. Not every hill is worth dying on.
Yeah, there's that one too.
Same thing. Pick your battles.
Right. But we don't, I think what we talked about when we engaged in this topic and even human trafficking, that you have to engage these things. You need the tools to engage them wisely. And maybe maybe Augustine here is giving us something helpful for that, right? Maybe self-defense he's not happy with, and we would be more willing to go there. But the idea of avenging injuries, to reclaim property, that's perfectly fine. They take your stuff, get it back.
Yeah.
Or you can go with Jesus and say, just give me your other one too.
Right. There's that. Yes.
There's that. Righteous intention. I mean, consider your heart, walk away, count to 10, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right? There's practical things to do there. Is it your authority? That's another good question. Right. And maybe it isn't your authority to just go take it back. Maybe it's your authority to report it.
Right. Well, and that's the flip side is that you can talk about open carry, conceal and carry. You can talk about, protecting your house, your property, neighborhood. But we still, I think, have to return to the flip side of where's the police? Where's the civil authority here? Are they present? Are they not present? Are they just? Are they unjust? Are they corrupt? Are they not corrupt? Like all of these things, like you said, you have to come at this from an informed position.
Right. Maybe being armed only allows you to delay, right? Until the police arrive.
Yeah. One of the things that bothers me in the present tense is I see pictures of people with their guns out pointed at each other, yelling at each other. There's a picture of a guy in a truck. He
Don't
got
point a gun
stopped.
at somebody unless you're willing to use it.
Exactly. And they're both have finger on the trigger, pistols 2 feet away from each other's faces. They're yelling at each other. They obviously have no intention whatsoever of shooting the gun.
But
However, exactly.
they're that
However,
close. They're that close. Yeah.
lots of things happen. They're obviously not disciplined they have no trigger discipline whatsoever. Therefore, that worries me then.
Yeah. Well, it was
You're
like,
not using that responsibly. It could go off. And then what's your argument in court? He stopped my car and we were yelling.
yeah. I mean, this is the whole thing with why hands up?
Right.
Because the policeman who is armed, usually
Right.
in our country, they need to know your intent.
Yeah.
And if you start going for whatever it is, they have authority, to use force. And we don't have to like that, but it's like they got to protect themselves too.
Right.
And they're the authority in this situation, whether you like it or not. And you've actually given them that authority in a sense, because you're a citizen. So
yeah,
it's difficult.
Mine, former friend who was a cop, talked about it. Said, "Here's my weekend. It's dark, it's overcast. We're on the side of a 4-lane highway. Cars going by at 70 miles an hour. I get out of my vehicle. I've got cars buzzing by me at 70. Like you said, I'm trusting that they see me on the side of the highway or care enough to swerve.
Right.
So I got that in my mind. I'm thinking about, okay, I can't see in this person's windows. They have tinted windows. I can't see in their car. So I don't know what their intent is. They were going 70 miles an hour in a 55 or whatever. It's 12:30 at night. Are they drunk? Are they high? Are they not? Are they on their way to the hospital? What's going on? I don't know. But I've already had all these other calls tonight. And so I'm tired. I'm stressed. I'm anxious. I'm trying to just deal with what I've already gone through.
Yeah.
And you're walking up to a window. And like you said, where's this person's hands? Are they on the steering wheel or are they on the lap? Are they reaching for their glove box? Are they reaching for something on the island? What's going on? Are they going to turn on the dome light inside the car? Are there other people inside the car? Are they in the back seat? Like, you're thinking all of these things. And
you have
ultimately,
to.
because
Yeah.
and as a husband and father, he's asking himself, is this the last thing that I'm going to do before I die?
And you don't know.
Because he's like, I'm a human being, man. Of course I'm thinking about my wife and kids when I'm walking up to a car. Of course I'm stressed out and I'm emotional. I've had a rough night. I'm a human being. I've been lied to 6 times. I've been threatened a couple times, et cetera, et cetera. I've had to deal with a domestic violence call where you're like, yeah, I'd like to yank you out of this house and put you in a shelter, but I can't because now you flipped your story and you're defending the guy who just stabbed you, that kind of stuff.
I don't even think Augustine's thought about it from that perspective. I think he's thinking only from the citizen perspective.
I agree. I agree.
At least what's presented here. It's just not as thoroughgoing a philosophy as what comes later from, say,
Well, and here's the author's then commentary.
Yeah.
Any such attempt is bound to be a distortion that masks his Augustine's inner turmoil and renders explicit assumptions that were at best implicit in his writings.
Oops.
His scattered thoughts were not systematic precedents for future actions. Regarding licit violence in a just war, Augustine contented himself with the general advice that patience and mercy be shown. He did suggest that in this sinful world, a war could be partially just on both sides. He clearly thought wars of conquest were illicit, but he did not distinguish clearly between offensive and defensive wars.
Like we were talking about.
Yeah. Paradoxically, he sought both to limit warfare and to justify it under certain conditions. For him, the burden of proof lay upon those who wished to go to war. His chief value was to explore how to think about warfare in a Christian context, and thereby to bring discussions about it within the bounds of moral discourse, like we've just discussed.
Yeah, so personal responsibility. What's my role as a citizen in warfare? And then, we talked about it leading into this last week. What about the soldier? And is it enough to simply say, well, I have the authority to do X, Y, Z? Right. Or are you also still a moral agent?
Well, think about in World War II, buy war bonds, recycle, don't waste anything. And the entire society was a part of the war effort.
The war machine, really.
The war machine. And in the present tense, I know people in Afghanistan right now. I know people in Iraq right now and other places. And there are people here in this country who when they see them on the news complaining about how oppressed they are and how much they don't have, and all the lack of opportunities, and they're in northern Afghanistan, for example, and they're seeing actual atrocities and people who are actually oppressed.
Right.
And ultimately, I'm over here fighting for these people. I'm fighting for my comrades in arms to make sure they get home to their families safe. And like one guy said, you go home on leave. 48 hours ago, I was being shot at from a hillside. Now I'm sitting at an IHOP with my family and they're laughing. And I'm like, this can't be real. Like, this
Yeah.
cannot be the same world, but it
Creates like
is.
an existential crisis. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And so with World War II, there was this whole will of the people moving toward this objective, overcome the socialists, the Nazis.
That's why they had parades when they came home.
Right. Versus in the present tense, when guys come home, it's like, thank you for your service. And maybe your town has a parade for you. Maybe they meet you at the airport, or you get you get an upgraded flight, but it's not the same will of the people that are behind these people going and doing, these soldiers going and doing these things. And so you see this change in tone, generation to generation. You saw it with Vietnam, with Korea. We saw it with the first Desert Storm. The public will changed, and therefore the way in which we looked at law enforcement and the military changed, including the present tense.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Augustine is essentially saying, no, that's their vocation. That's their vocation. They were put there by God to protect us and defend us, and therefore that's their job. We pray for them. We
Right.
support them. And as long as it's legitimate and it's not, we're not going out there to kill them before they come here and kill us, which, by the way, violates every rule of military combat.
Of
We'll just
course.
sit
Yeah.
here and wait for them to kill, attack.
It was funny that we argued about first strike.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I guess we just hadn't really dealt with it so much as a country. Especially we had the what was it leading into World War II? It was pacifism, but there was a term for it.
Isolationism.
Yeah, isolationism, right? And it's basically, well, yeah, no, but we're not going to be able to go to war until there's Pearl Harbor. It was
Mm-hmm.
kind of the thing.
Right. Well, same thing kind of with World War I,
Yeah.
Lusitania.
No, that's true. Yeah. And uh, is that unfortunate? The lives lost? I mean, we really had that with the second Iraq War, with Afghanistan. Well, really with Afghanistan more than anything, because there's 9/11. It's like,
well, and that's
clearly
what we know now that perhaps Augustine either was naive to or willfully ignorant of, is that false flag events are used to get us to justify entering into a conflict under the context of legitimate reasons.
Well, this is now like part of discourse, is what is a just war.
Exactly. And that's what
It's
I'm saying.
always
It's like,
part of the discourse.
because of the dissemination of information and the internet and things like WikiLeaks, and just the immediacy of data and how quickly we can access data, we can ask this question in the present tense and say, well, is this a false flag event? Is this really true? Do they really, are they really guilty of what you're accusing them of? Do we really want to enter into this? Why are we entering into this? We
Why
have
were
all
we
these
in Nicaragua? Why were we in Syria?
why were
Yeah.
we in Nicaragua? Guns for drugs. Anyways,
well,
yeah.
even when that's revealed, and it's common knowledge now.
Yeah.
It's not. People forget.
Yeah. Well, it's not taught. It's not talked about. I mean, Tom Cruise made a movie about it, but other than that,
I suppose, yeah. No.
It's a good movie, by the way. It's actually a really good movie. American made.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point too, is that, yeah, we can look in the past and say, well, Augustine was naive, or he was too broad and generalized in what he was saying. But like when I read Luther on whether a Christian can flee the plague or not, Luther's response is, you're an adult. Think
pretty
for
much.
yourself.
Yeah, pretty much. If you need to leave, you leave. If you can stay, you stay.
And maybe in a sense, without diving too deep in Against Faustus or City of God, because I've read City of God, but not Against Faustus, at least not thoroughly, Augustine's responding to what's happening around him.
Yeah, that's right.
He used the military to put down the Donatists, like I said, but at the same time, he doesn't want Rome sending a military to basically be there all the time on base where he's at.
It's less of a systematic theology and more of a contemporary theology.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so in a sense, we're very similar to Augustine in that Rome had this empire and they had military all over the place. We have military bases all over the world. But dissimilarly, I think Augustine's approach to just war is, like the author says, it's very implicit, a lot of it. And so we read into it a lot to justify whatever it is that we are, arguing for against in the present tense. I think out of Augustine, you could argue for pacifism.
Right.
And you could argue for militarism.
Right. And I think the author's right. Augustine wants discourse, which is very much what we want too. I mean, we're thinking about like peaceful protests or violent riots, depending on how you want to define them. I mean, not everyone is the same either.
Let's define it this way. If you don't burn down a building or shoot at officers, it's peaceful.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as saying, well, the police are always right or the protesters are always right, no, I'm not ever going to be that nuanced. And actually, I'm probably going to be pretty individual.
Right.
Obtuse.
That obtuse.
Well, think about the way. What was it? Where was it? It was in California, where you had the protesters march, and then you had the rioters march behind them.
Right. That happened in Minneapolis.
Did it? Okay.
Yeah. Is that we had protesters, and then when they went home around 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, by 10, 11 o'clock at night, that's when it got violent.
Yeah. And so, but I mean, literally, they had the video where the people would march by, and then, a block or so later, worth of people would come through and start destroying things. And you're like, these are obviously not the same people.
Right? Well, and the head of the NAACP in Portland just wrote that editorial, essentially changing what he said several weeks prior to this, saying they've co-opted this protest.
Yeah.
These other forces, these other people have co-opted this movement. It was peaceful and now it's not.
Right. I mean, you could probably make the case that they're both trying to avenge injury. But obviously one with righteous intention and the other not, maybe.
Right.
I mean, again, my point is like,
well, Augustine's point is there's an actual injury. I see a lot of people
protesting,
lash out, and they want to protest a perceived injury that's self-invented.
Oh, like student loan debt or something.
That too, but just it's the victim mentality. I'm a victim of forces outside my control. Therefore, I'm going to steal shoes.
Well, yeah. I mean, were you injured when George Floyd died? I think you could make maybe some case in a general sense.
Yeah, and maybe I was going to say in a broader societal sense, you could say we were all injured,
right,
by it. But yet, how it spun itself out, you can then, I think, argue that some people, the injury led to this movement, and then for others, that injury led to this. Never let a good crisis go to waste, as some have said.
Rahm Emanuel, right? No, his brother. It's his brother. I can't remember his brother's name.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Obama quoted it. Yep.
Okay.
President. Yeah.
There you go. So I think at the very least, Augustine provides us with a foundation to work from.
Yeah.
He gives us some language to use to talk about it in the present tense.
Well, I like the idea of, whose authority? That's a good question always to ask. Is there injury? What's the injury? What's appropriate recourse for that? And then what's your intention? What are you trying to do here?
It's like Solomon with the baby.
Yeah, it is.
The 2 wives, or the 2 women, I'm sorry, 2 mothers.
Yeah, and it's terribly violent suggestion he makes, isn't it?
But that's his point, right? He's like, I'll figure out who's righteous pretty quick.
Well, and it's interesting because they want to do actual violence to this child, or at least the one does, the false mother, right? Yeah. And just to point that out, then he agrees to it, right? Is he actually legitimately going to do it? No, but the point is to show this woman is clearly not the mother because she's violent.
I never thought of doing this before until you just mentioned it, but I've never actually used that incident in relation to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. God had never had any intent whatsoever of allowing Abraham to sacrifice Isaac.
Of course not.
And yet, it's a horribly violent act.
But Abraham believed that even before he went up the mountain.
Exactly.
God is going to return my son.
Right. And Solomon believed that the real mother would rather give the baby away than allow it to die.
Correct.
She'd rather sacrifice her own love. That's true unconditional love. That's sacrificial love.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
There you go. Nice parallel.
Get that one. There we go. So,
but that's that righteous intention, right?
Right. And I think leading off of actually what we've just been discussing in this episode, we got a question from Tom, longtime listener. Shout out to Tom and his wife. I love you and your kids. Actually, you're fantastic people. He asked about a civil disobedience.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And how Christians stand in relation to civil disobedience, because that's kind of what we led to is there war in the streets? Is this civil disobedience?
Yeah.
phrase this
Well,
way.
and
So
that's that. Yeah. When can you defend yourself? Which.
because I listened to commentary yesterday, conversation of the reason that these rioters or protesters, however you want to frame it, are losing the propaganda war, the public war, is because when middle of the road normal Americans turn on their TV and they see people throwing Molotov cocktails and screaming at the police and doing all these things, breaking windows of federal buildings, they say to themselves, well, I'm not down with that.
Yeah.
I can't
Right.
support that.
Right.
But when they saw Martin Luther King Jr. marching, and someone was just driven over the bridge this past weekend who died. He was a part of that original march.
John.
John, yes. What's his name? Look it up for me, please.
I was going to say John Adams, but that's not right.
No. But when people in Middle America saw Martin Luther King Jr. and all these protesters marching, and they saw them in suits, and they saw
John Lewis.
John Lewis, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies for forgetting John Lewis's name. He's a great man.
Yeah.
But when people saw Dr. King march and they saw him speak and they heard him speak, and he talked about God and he talked about justice and he talked about peace, that's why people came from all over the country to join the march.
Yep.
Because they saw that and went, oh, I'm down with that. And then they saw people turning hoses on these people. They saw dogs attacking. They're like, why are these dogs attacking? Why are they letting this happen when they're just walking? And he's talking about God and Jesus and peace and justice. Like, what's wrong with that?
They saw it as a righteous cause. Yeah.
They saw it as a righteous cause versus in the present tense, those same kinds of people and even people that were involved in those marches who are now old timers are saying, nope, I'm not down with this. This isn't a righteous cause.
Yeah.
And maybe originally it was, like you pointed out, it was originally a righteous cause. We need to reform the police. We need to stop this from happening in our streets.
Or even in this one case, justice
right
needs to be done. He needs to be avenged.
It's spun itself out then in the present tense, even people who were sympathetic at the beginning and saying, no, I'm down with the cause, we need this to happen, now are saying, whoa, no, this is not the way for this to happen.
Yeah, right.
It's not legitimate.
Well, and would, I mean, the question is, would Mr. Floyd go for what he's, I don't know. I don't think based off of what I remember reading about him, yeah, he would never have advocated this kind of violence.
Well, he's become a symbol. He's ceased to be a human being. He's just a symbol.
Oh, that's true. He's just an icon. Yeah.
And so I think, let's talk about, we'll find some, maybe from the colonial period about civil disobedience, from the Revolutionary War or Civil War even.
Oh, wow.
Or there's a lot of Second World War stuff about conscientious objectors.
Yeah, that's true.
That's different than civil disobedience. I shouldn't say that. But I can definitely say that I've engaged in civil disobedience, but you've told me that my leader isn't civil, so therefore it's not civil disobedience. So there's that dichotomy we can
What do you call it? Yeah, if they're not civil, it's just disobedience, I guess.
There's certain things in the past 5 months that I have chosen to willfully ignore for the sake of civil disobedience.
Well, and then the nuance that we can talk about then is what if the law and the authorities are in conflict, right?
Right, exactly. Now, like we've been discussing with this.
Who do you listen to? Who do you obey? What do you obey? I mean, how do you know what's right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
It is.
So we'll end there. As always, we know your time and your attention is valuable, and it's valuable to us. So we greatly appreciate you lending it to us and giving us your ear for this time. I hope that these last 2 episodes were helpful and got you thinking about just war or conflict in general, and get you talking about it with friends and family and others. Have the conversation, just like with human trafficking, have the conversation about war and conflict.
Yeah. And
then next episode, we'll come back and talk about civil disobedience, another topic that we don't talk about enough in the church, in my opinion.
We'll see.
We'll see. So thank you as always, and go check out 1517 and all that is being produced by 1517 and all the podcasts and all the publications and all the articles and stuff. And we'll see you next week for a brand new episode. Peace.